What I want to do today is just give you sort of an overview of um, the difference between medical genetic testing and what is now quite popular, which is like the direct to consumer type of genetic testing that you can order on your own. And there are things to consider before making that decision. So I'm going to highlight a few ways this can be very helpful and ways that this could actually cause some harm. So, all right. So every year around Thanksgiving typically is when all of these things go on sale, because Thanksgiving is often the time when um, large family gatherings are happening. There's family reunions, there's big dinners. And so all the DNA test companies start advertising, and it's all very positive. It's all very glowing. It's the gift of discovery, begin your journey, empower yourself, amaze yourself. All the marketing language is very flowery and over the top and makes it sound like this is just the best thing you could possibly do for yourself and your family. That may or may not be the case. And part of understanding why that is having a bit of an understanding of when we use the term genetic test, unless you work in molecular biology or in a medical lab or in this area, it's kind of like the magical black box where you don't know what's happening. You give your sample, blood or saliva, it goes away, and then a report comes. But like, what's actually happening in between those two events? And this is an analogy I use when I'm actually explaining how this works to patients. And I find for folks who are not working in a lab or in molecular biology, this actually is a really helpful analogy to understand what's going on. So the starting point is that in our genome, packed into every single one of our trillions and trillions of cells that make up who we are, there's about 20,000 genes. And I like to anthropomorphize these little genes as like they're little instruction manuals. They're creating proteins that do the business of building our bodies and making all the things happen. So usually when you see a gene name, it's a combination of letters and numbers like this. So, for example, DMD is the Duchenne muscular dystrophy gene. AR is the androgen receptor gene. Sometimes the names make sense, sometimes they don't. But at the end of the day, there's about 20,000 of these. And each one does a different task. It has a different protein or signal that it generates. And so if you think of each gene like an instruction manual, you actually have 2 copies of each of those instruction manuals. I'm not counting the Y chromosome just for the sake of simplicity here, but on all the other chromosomes, you have 2 copies. You got one of each gene from your mom and your dad. The example I use is the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. Those are genes that a lot of people have heard of before because they're related to elevated risk of breast and ovarian cancers. So those are sort of my example ones. But when we do genetic testing, if I'm going to do genetic testing for somebody for BRCA1 and BRCA2, it's like I'm going into this library of 20,000 pairs of manuals and I'm pulling just those 2 off the shelf. So a lot of times patients will ask if like, well, while you're in there, can you look at these other things that I'm interested in? And the answer is usually no. This is very purposeful medical genetic testing. So when we actually want to do the testing, what is the lab doing? Well, the lab is effectively spell checking those instruction manuals. So if you remember back from high school biology, this is going way, way back, but the 4 nucleotides that make up our DNA, the initials we use are C, T, G, and A. And the sequence of those 4 nucleotides dictates what is the end product of this instruction manual. So we know from sequencing, lots of people in the population, what are the sequences of these genes that are not tolerable to any type of changes. You can't switch the letters around, you can't delete the letters, you can't add letters in. So this is sort of like if we use the spell checking analogy, this would be an example of a test where everything looks fine. Both copies of this person's BRCA2 gene show the same sequence. There's nothing out of the ordinary. This would be a normal test result. This would be somebody who tests positive for a mutation. So you can see down in the lower copy, there's a piece that's actually missing. That's called a deletion. You can have insertions, you can have deletions, you can have substitutions, you can have large changes in DNA. Basically anything that disrupts the normal spelling of that manual and means that that manual cannot generate whatever it normally would generate in the human body, usually a protein or an enzyme of some kind. This is what it looks like when you actually get a genetic test report back. So this is the snippet that says result BRCA1, and it gives a little code to tell everybody exactly what is the mutation that was identified. So here we see it's been labeled as a pathogenic mutation. That means it follows the guidelines, and we know that this mutation is actually disease causing. It's been, studied extensively, and they can put that label on it. The C.68_69del.AG means that at position 68 and 69 of the BRCA1 gene, there's supposed to be an A and a G, but it's been deleted. And so when this instruction goes to make the BRCA1 protein, it can't. It's missing the full set of instructions. It just doesn't work. And if you're missing a normal copy of your BRCA1 gene, that means you're at elevated risk of developing cancer. So when we think of medical testing, this is the stuff where, you would book an appointment to see a physician or a genetic counselor, and there's some medical reason to consider doing genetic testing. So some of the scenarios that come up are somebody who's planning a family and wants to know if they and their partner might be carrying mutations that don't affect them personally. But if both members of a couple happen to pass on a mutation in the same gene, they could have a child with a very serious medical condition. So we call this carrier testing, where people can find out if they are carriers for things like sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, a lot of thalassemias, a lot of really rare conditions, but that have profound effects on development in early childhood. So carrier testing is something that's typically done in a medical setting. Newborn screening, newborns that are born get a little heel prick, a drop of blood goes off to the lab, and they can now screen this very quickly for a series of genetic diseases where intervening early on is of incredible importance in having successful treatment. Babies who are born with medical problems or children that experience some kind of delay in their development or start developing some type of medical problem, often there ends up being a genetic cause or a genetic diagnosis. Where there's been a big shift in the last 15 or so years is people who have a strong family history of a disease and kind of feel like they're surrounded, like, okay, there have been 4 people in my family who've had heart attacks in their 20s. That's not normal. Is this going to happen to me? What can I do about it? Is there a test that will tell me if this is going to happen? Somebody has a diagnosis of a common disease, but wants to know if there's a genetic component. So in my cancer genetics clinic, this is almost exclusively what I see. People who may have a diagnosis of cancer, only about 5% of those may have a clear genetic cause, but it's important to identify that 5% so that their family members can learn about what they can do for prevention and early detection. So this is also true in cardiovascular disease. It's true with some neurological diagnoses. And then the other thing that's kind of starting to pick up a little bit of steam is the idea of making treatment decisions or making decisions about medications or medication dosing based on your genetic makeup. Everybody's kind of familiar with the idea that if you give 10 people the same drug, the same medication, you'll have maybe some people that get all the side effects, some people that kind of feel like, am I taking placebo? Is this thing even doing anything? And then most people, it will work the way it's intended. But there's a lot of variation in how people metabolize different medications. And so in some cases, it actually makes really good sense to do genetic testing to either monitor dosing or for some very rare situations before you even prescribe to know if this is an appropriate dose or not. And really the fundamental question here to label something as medical genetic testing is, will these results change my medical care in some way? Or my family planning in some way. So that's sort of, in the medical world where insurance is involved, you're seeing a healthcare provider that's ordering the test, it's going to a medical grade laboratory. This graph is always interesting to show because what happened, everybody's like, well, what happened in 2016? So there had always been genetic testing for a fair number of genetic conditions and genetic diseases, but in 2015, 2016 is when we saw a new technology emerge called next generation sequencing. And this made it incredibly cheap and easy to do gene sequencing at scale for a fraction of the price of the methods that used to be required to do genetic testing. And now you could do whole genomes. You could sequence a whole genome, you could do rapid throughput testing and at a fraction of the cost. So what happened is all the genetic testing labs, which are the tiny little purple bar, there haven't been like an explosion in the number of labs. But what those labs were able to do is say, look, we can now offer testing instead of 1 or 2 genes at a time for $4,000 each. We can do 50 genes for $500, $1,000. So this was game changing in the genetics world. It really changed the way in the medical community we order genetic tests. And it really, also changed the out-of-pocket cost for people who were interested in doing genetic testing, but maybe their insurance wasn't going to pay for it. It did make it much, much more accessible. Okay. One important thing to note is that the yield of genetic testing is inversely associated with age. So most serious genetic illness is something that's diagnosed in infancy or childhood. The larger the impact of a genetic mutation or a genetic anomaly, the earlier on it's going to present itself, either as a diagnosis or some kind of change with development. By the time you get to retirement age, most of your health issues at that point are not really driven by your genes. They're driven by your exposures, your health behaviors, the aging process itself, as opposed to, things the idea of things lurking in your genes that don't show up for, 60, 70, 80 years. The yield of doing a genetic test once you're over 60 is just not anywhere near as great as it is when you are a child or when you're a young adult. Although health insurance is typically the enemy in my world because we just are nonstop fighting with them all the time, insurance will often cover genetic testing if it is deemed medically necessary, particularly if it can be used to put higher risk people into some kind of risk reduction or early detection monitoring, where the goal is to avoid serious complications of disease later on. We like that because it means people are healthier for longer. The insurance companies like that because then they're not spending more money on more advanced treatments for people who have more advanced disease. So we align, but for all the wrong reasons. The other thing I feel is important to note when artificial intelligence is such a hot topic now, is that a human health provider orders a medical genetic test. So if you come into my clinic, I will enter into the medical record, what is the genetic test that I'm ordering? And a human molecular geneticist, although a lot of the actual sequence interpretation is done by computer and AI supported, it's actually a human board certified molecular geneticist that puts their name on the report and says, I am certifying that this met quality control, that I've reviewed the result, and I'm comfortable putting my name on this. I'm bringing this up because the other types of genetic testing I'm going to talk about, that's not part of the process. It's all completely automated. And there's the usual, like any type of medical genetic test or any type of medical test, I should say, there's quality metrics that need to be met. Every now and then I get a call from the lab saying, you're going to have to get another sample. This person, we just couldn't get enough DNA out of their sample to make sure that we are giving you an accurate result. Can we get another sample? So they have quality metrics that need to be met. There's medical legal safeguards in place because it's treated as part of your medical record. So privacy laws apply. That's not necessarily the case for a lot of other types of genetic, I'll use air quotes, testing. All right. So just to, sort of give a comparison on the technical side, this is a little bit technical, but the difference between medical genetic testing and what I'm going to call direct to consumer testing, where you can send in a saliva sample and order it online and get a report back without ever interacting with a healthcare provider. The technique is very different, and this is actually responsible for the accuracy challenges that happen in the direct to consumer world. So in medical testing, it's that spell check of every letter in the manual in the genes that you're interested in. Every single nucleotide is getting sequenced to see, is this what we expect or is it something different? Direct to consumer testing is typically done with what's called a microarray, and it's not sequencing all the genes. It's kind of like taking a couple of the letters in the book and just looking at those. It's not looking at the whole book. So in any given gene, maybe they're looking at 10 or 12 nucleotides, not the thousands that are actually present. So it's a very limited scratching the surface type of test. And the ones that are selected are usually selected because they're better markers of ancestry. That's what drives most of these tests at the end of the day, is ancestry testing. The reporting in a direct to consumer, it's completely automated. Nobody's checking anything. It gets automatically generated. Whereas in a medical lab, a human qualified person signs that report and reviews it. Do they confirm with a different technique any mutation that shows up that could impact your health? Not in a direct to consumer lab. Usually that's done in a medical laboratory. The testing in a medical laboratory is usually a gene panel where we are looking at multiple genes at the same time. And we're sequencing the full gene from beginning to end. Whereas the direct to consumer, it's mostly what are called SNPs, which is single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are single little one letter changes that vary from person to person. So they're looking at a couple of those. They will not be able to detect large genetic changes, like a large deletion or a large insertion. You can order a direct-to-consumer test yourself and you can pay for it yourself, whereas medical grade testing is ordered through a medical encounter, a healthcare provider, and often health insurance will cover it. There are now a new sort of hybrid type of test that is available. It's called physician-mediated test. So you're still in the privacy of your own home. You can go in and say, I would like to get this genetic test. And then a healthcare provider somewhere, I don't know where, reviews it and says, yes, I will order this test on your behalf. And then a report gets generated. Those are generally medical quality tests, but it's kind of getting around a loophole of you're not going in and actually talking to anybody to see, is the right test getting ordered for you. It's still a very generic automated type of test. So now that we're talking about direct to consumer tests, what can it tell you and what can't it tell you? This, I don't intend to go through the whole thing, but this is from the terms of service. I can't remember which page it is. From 23andMe, one of the very popular companies. But key things they say, none of this information shall be relied upon as medical advice. So even though their advertising implies empower yourself, get valuable health information, they literally say this is not medical information. And then up at the top, they say, we make no warranty that this service will be accurate or reliable. So they're not even pretending it's accurate, right? It's right there. We will make no guarantees. If you ever saw this at a medical laboratory, if you were going in to get a healthcare workup for any kind of test, and they said, yeah, may or may not be accurate, we're not going to use this as medical information, you wouldn't do it, right? So for medical purposes, buyer beware, sincerely. That said, there are what I call the nuggets of truth that can appear in these tests. And the reason there are little things that can be accurate is because some of the companies actually went through the process of validating certain of those SNPs, certain of those little tiny genetic changes that can occur in the DNA. And they tested themselves and they kind of went through the same rigorous process that a medical lab would to say, look, we feel confident if we give you information about these 3 BRCA mutations, only 3. There are thousands of possible BRCA mutations. If you think of spell checking and you could have a spelling error in any of those locations, there are 3 mutations that are more commonly found in people who have European Jewish ancestry. And one company has kind of said, well, look, we tested ourselves over and over again, and we feel confident with that report. So we're actually going to put that on a report. There's still not a human that reviews it and signs it. So a lot of the usual safeguards are not in place. But if we see that on a report, we will still order it in a medical lab to confirm it, because we don't want anybody going and doing any medical procedures on the basis of a direct-to-consumer report where we know there's errors. But it's usually going to end up being correct. Same thing with some of their Alzheimer's risk profile information. Sometimes there's little, I think there's a Parkinson's variant that they validated and confirmed. So there are a handful of little things, but it's really in no way a comprehensive genetic test. And importantly, you can never infer that if your direct-to-consumer test came back and said, like, there's nothing to see here, you cannot infer that that's actually true. You may well be carrying something very important in terms of genetic health risk. These stories come up all the time, and every now and then I go and I lurk on message boards just to see like what the chatter is out in the general population of folks who are doing these types of tests. And a lot of things that we see, or something that's become kind of popular, is this homebrew idea where you do one of these tests, and then rather than trust the company to kind of report what they see, people will download their raw data from the company and then go to an app, put the app on their phone and upload their genetic data into the app, and then let the app tell them an interpretation. And this causes all kinds of problems because the apps are poor quality. It's just people looking to make a buck for the most part. There is so much technical stuff that goes into this that ends up being very difficult to work through. So, a lot of times people will say, I did this process and it told me I have a mutation and I'm kind of freaking out, right? So people posting things like, I've got health anxiety, I did this test, the mutation, it proved to be false. Can I find this variant? I've got a mutation, but neither of my parents do. Like, people asking questions on a public message board about like, what even is this? And most of the time, these are found to be errors. These are not correct results. It's kind of this back-end homebrew interpretation that in no way mimics the actual genetic testing process. And the reason for that, again, this is a little bit technical. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but the conclusion of this study that came out of the UK Biobank, which is in this particular study, they looked at about 50,000 people. They're basically saying, look, this technique to do medical testing is just not accurate enough. It's extremely unreliable. In their study, they kind of worked their way down through the tree here. They found about 190 people who, on this SNP array, the method that the DTC, the direct-to-consumer places use, had a positive result for a BRCA mutation. And it turns out only 17% of those were true positives. The rest were false positives. So this tells you, that this is not reliable information. The other thing that is frustrating about a lot of the output, sometimes they'll give you like a chart and it'll say, here are your risks of various types of disease compared to the general population. So it might say, because at this position in this gene, you have the letter C instead of the letter T. We know that people who have a C there have triple the risk of whatever disease this is we're talking about. And you go and you look into it and you're like, well, at 1 out of 10,000 people versus 3 out of 10,000 people, that's noise, right? That's statistical noise. And a lot of the data that goes into generating this output is not confirmed, is not validated. When I do this I do it for education and teaching purposes. So I know like, what are people actually getting? I don't fill in the health information accurately. I don't really want the company to know my personal health information, so I don't fill it in. So they're using that data then to make statements like this, like, oh, all the people who had this reported that they had this particular diagnosis. not necessarily true. Nobody's coming and looking at my medical records to confirm anything that I said. So it's not presented in a helpful way. It's presented in kind of an alarmist way. Often the results will give like several significant digits that implies a high degree of accuracy, and just the accuracy is not there. And then just to step away from the medical testing, this is a lot of times what people are really interested in is the stuff that can happen when you do these tests. This is where it is 100% accurate. This is DNA testing, and family relationships will be revealed, full stop, completely accurate. Because on my news ticker, I get genetics news stories coming by all the time. So I find these and I keep them just because they're so interesting. But these are stories you hear all the time. And I have heard many of my own patients tell similar types of stories. So these aren't just sort of like alarmist clickbait headlines. But people who do a genetic test, and with most of the companies, there's a button you can click when you get your results back, and it says, find relatives or allow people to match to my DNA. And that's where everything can go really well, or it can go really poorly, depending on your perspective. One thing that's come out of the widespread use of genetic testing is finding that around the world, in this particular instance down here, this was in the Netherlands, that there have been individuals who have been serial sperm donors. And so people who were doing DNA testing would like, oh, I found a half sibling. Oh, I found another half sibling. Oh, I found 20 more half siblings. I have 50 half siblings. So a lot of times these folks who were all conceived through sperm donation, and it turns out that, in several cases, it was actually the fertility doctor running the in vitro fertilization program using their own sperm. In other cases, there's medical students that just kind of make the rounds and make a buck on the side by donating sperm. There are now starting to be some safeguards in place to protect against this. There are supposed to be limits on the number of times donor sperm is used for IVF purposes. But as you can see, the regulation here is probably far behind, and it depends on where this is happening. So this is something that's come up a number of times. And there are like Facebook support groups for people who have all found half siblings, and they're kind of like, we're kind of family. But it can be devastating for a lot of folks to kind of feel like this was how they came to be. The other thing that happens is the idea of people finding out that there's what we call a non-paternity event. So dad is not who you think dad is. With genetic testing, I gave my parents the gift of divorce. People buy it, it goes under the tree, or, you give it out. Everybody, I got a deal on these genetic tests, and then let's all open our results together. And okay, dad doesn't match to anybody. Oh, I wonder if there was an error. And then mom is just like kind of receding into the background, right? So these things are accurate. Unfortunately, the idea of sample mix-up, it can happen, but more likely it's that the family relationships are not what people were led to believe in terms of who are parents, who might be adopted in or out, people finding out they were donor conceived when their parents never told them, even when they became adults. So, and it's not like you can control who else in the world has participated in this. So even though you may think, okay, I'm going to just buy this for myself, I'm not going to buy it for mom and dad. But then you go into, the relative finder and you find out like, oh yeah, okay, there's my cousin Jim. Okay, I guess I am related to him in the way I thought I would be. But why are no relatives on my dad's side here? They told me they all did this and they're not appearing. And I have all these other people that are supposed to be close relatives that I've never heard of before. These are the things that can happen. And it's like anything in life, people always assume, oh, that's not going to be my situation until it is your situation. So I do always tell people to like kind of be mentally prepared to get some surprises, because you just don't know. And a lot of times older generations were just not as forthcoming about adoption, or changes in family relationships when there was more of a stigma. And so sometimes these stories perpetuate in a family and you just don't get the information. Sometimes it can do good though, right? So sometimes people who are adopted want to find their birth family and learn about if there are medical risks in the family. Sometimes you can reunite people, in extreme cases. Here's somebody who was abducted as a child and was able to find her biological family at the age of like 53, I think. People who had been, put in the wrong bassinet in the hospital and got swapped. There are ways that DNA can be used for reunification, and there are political examples around the world where DNA technology has been used for, identifying human remains after disasters, taking like stolen children and reuniting them with their biological families. So there are situations where it can actually be used for good. In terms of the accuracy of ancestry testing, which is different than am I related to this person or not? And if so, how closely related? Broadly speaking, it's quite accurate. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you go back far enough, the broader you get in terms of where did your ancestors come from, that's generally going to be reasonably accurate. Once people start making claims about, like, we can pinpoint the village that your great-grandfather came from, not so much, because again, that just relies on people's self-reporting where they were told their ancestors came from, as opposed to mapping this onto some kind of hard evidence of the regions that people originated from. In some situations, it can be extremely accurate, but it's another kind of buyer beware situation. What gets disturbing about this is when people get their results and it gives them percentages of what, where in the world their ancestors came from. And you start to see language like this on message boards where the word pure kind of starts making an appearance, and it's a little unsettling. Is it common to be this pure? I guess my dad's a purebred. Other people feel like, okay, this confirms what I thought, and kind of, statements about identity. And a few years ago, I haven't seen anything recently about this, but a couple of years ago, when there was sort of an uptick in the slope of white supremacist rhetoric, kind of took a big turn up. We started seeing stories like this, where it was almost like a purity test. Like, okay, if you want to be in our group, we're going to need you to do a DNA test. So some very disturbing uses of this technology. The other things I like to point out are issues around privacy concerns. So if you're handing off your DNA to a private company, read the terms of service so you understand, if they can turn around and use your DNA to create some blockbuster therapy and they become bajillionaires, you get nothing. That's probably in the terms of service that you clicked on and signed. Who are they sharing it with? Are they selling your data? Are you okay with that? A lot of people are, if the idea is I'm selling it because I hope they can improve treatments for disease. That's a good thing. On the other hand, it's like, well, why is a for-profit company profiting off of my DNA? Can I get in on that? So you always want to read the terms of service and understand, how is the data stored? What happens if this company goes under? Does this go on a hard drive in a basement somewhere? Or, what will actually happen to the stored data? How long do you store it? How do you destroy it? If I write you and say, please destroy my data, will they do that? Can I be guaranteed that? If, not to sound paranoid, but I think these are just reasonable questions to ask of a company that is a for-profit genetic test company. And if you're a criminal, you're probably going to have relatives on here that are going to connect you to a crime like the Golden State Killer case. So just to wrap up, the key points to think about: the ancestry parts of testing are mostly accurate. Biological relationships are completely accurate, and they can and will be revealed through this type of testing. Health reports are not based on quality controlled data. It's typically automated. And before taking any medical action, you want to have anything that you found in one of these tests confirmed in a medical grade laboratory. And if you're interested in something related to assessing a health risk, looking at medication options, what is my risk of having a child with a serious medical condition, those ancestry-based tests and the raw data are just not adequate. You really do want to pursue medical grade testing through a healthcare provider if that's your goal. So I will wrap up there, and I hope people might have anecdotes or stories or questions that we can start talking about. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. That was just wonderful. That was really so very interesting. And I would like people now to unmute themselves, to use the command at the bottom to ask questions. And I see one already. There's Georgia Sadler. Hi, Georgia.
Hi there. What a great presentation. I was so happy to be part of this. Thank you very much, both of you, for arranging it. Lisa, why don't you talk a little bit about the All of Us study, where that's a little bit of a really good study for all of us to be in, right? And it has pretty reliable data. So maybe we could brag about that and encourage people to participate.
Yeah, and thank you for coming, Georgia. So delightful to hear your voice after such a while. I'm so delighted. I hope you're keeping well. So yeah, the All of Us study, and UCSD is actually one of the lead sites in California for the All of Us. And it's funny, whenever you say it, people think like olives. What do olives have to do with anything? It's all of us, like collectively, all of us. Just because otherwise it sounds like olives sometimes when I say it. So this is a large national study, and the goal is to do a better job of what's called phenotyping. So one of the challenges we have in genetics is there's genotyping, which we can do very accurately. That's reading the sequence of the genes. Phenotyping is, okay, what health issues actually are present? Do we have a full-blown diagnosis that's obvious and anybody could see it without genetic testing? Or is this a little bit more subtle and not really clear that somebody has this diagnosis, but how does that not match with their genetic test results? So one of the biggest challenges we have is being able to say, look, if you have a particular genetic change, what do we think is going to happen in the future in terms of health? What is your level of risk of a genetic disease? What can we say about prognosis? So studies like All of Us request that participants ideally give permission to have their medical records reviewed in parallel with providing a DNA sample. One of the nice things about that study is that people will receive back pertinent health information as it shows up. So if you are found to carry a mutation in the BRCA genes, for example, the All of Us study will report that back to you because it's medically actionable, and that's the ethical thing to do. In exchange, the idea is to collect the phenotypic data, so blood samples, cholesterol levels, blood counts, all the kind of standard medical information, in addition to being able to look at medical records, so we can actually do a better job of saying, this mutation in this gene leads to this risk of this disease, and be more confident about how accurate that is. I believe the website is allofus.org. I am pretty sure it's that, but if you Google literally All of Us study, UCSD is a recruitment site. So if you get your medical care at UCSD, often if they see you have an appointment coming up, they'll just say, hey, do you want to meet ahead of time, go over the consent, sign the consent, give your blood sample at that point in time. So this is kind of similar to the UK Biobank. There's a lot of studies now, and it takes tens to hundreds of thousands of participants, ideally from as diverse a group of people as possible. One of the challenges with genetics is that historically, a lot of the data has been based on people of European ancestry, because those tended to be the folks that had access to these very expensive genetic tests in a medical setting. Whereas underserved communities really did not necessarily have that same type of access. So the databases really sadly, are predominantly skewed towards what is the genetic makeup of people with European ancestry. To the point where if I'm actually telling someone who is, I had a patient from the Philippines the other day, and I just say, look, there's a higher chance for you that I'm going to get a result back on your report that says, we see something in your DNA and we don't think it's a mutation, but we can't be sure. So they label that as something called a variant of unknown significance. Psychologically, it plants a seed of doubt, right? Even though I can do all the reassurance in the world and say, oh, these are usually nothing to worry about, it's planted a seed. Maybe that is something important. Should I get my family tested for this, right? So until we have a more representative databases to be able to say, oh, okay, no, this little genetic change is actually really common in the Philippines, people whose families come from there. But until we know that, these they're not really false positive results, but they're results that are ambiguous, keep coming up. So that's the other thing the All of Us study aims to do, is really diversify the genetic background that is present in the databases right now. You see another old colleague, Joel.
Joel's on there. Why don't you go? And
This is lovely.
I see a couple people in chat who are writing, and so
Oh, let me open chat.
the people in chat, if you would use the hand raise, and if you don't use the hand raise, then I'm gonna read your questions. But go, Joel, you go, and then I will go to the, I'll alternate and go to the chats if those people don't raise their hand and log in. But Joel, why don't you go next? Joel and Alan in sequence, and then I'll go to the hand raise, to the chat.
Sure. Lisa, thank you so much. This was just a terrific lecture. Pertinent to what you were just saying, is there a published glossary or something that indicates the degree or the number of tests that have been performed in a population? Now, I grant you going to one village versus another, but in one of those snippets that you showed us, there was somebody who was talking about Kurdish background. I mean, many parts of the world with refugees, this is pressingly important. Do we have, do any of these ancestry sites say, well, our confidence in Kurdistan is limited because we only have 17 people as opposed to 17,000? Is that kind of data available?
It is, to the extent that it depends on who went in and did the testing. Did they put it into a public database, and is it now available? So the gold standard for population genomic data is a publicly available database called GNOMAD, but with a G at the beginning. So GNOMAD. And in that database, it aims to just collect all publicly available data, break it down by region as much as possible. But at the end of the day, you are sometimes at the mercy of, like if a private company goes to Iceland and says, okay, this is a genetically isolated population, and I'm using this example because this happened. We're going to test, thousands of people. We're going to make a map, a genomic map of the people of Iceland. We're going to sell it in a really cool way because it's genetically isolated. Young people can tap their phones together and it will tell them how closely related they are before they start dating, all these kinds of bells and whistles. But at the end of the day, people of Iceland were like, wait a minute, that's our data and you're taking it and you're not making it publicly available for the greater good. So there are limitations at some point. Your point about, places where there are big refugee populations is a really important one. And a lot of it then comes down to self-identity, right? So if you're doing a DNA test, a lot of these ancestry tests end up being sort of like self-fulfilling prophecies. If you say, oh yeah, my 4 grandparents were all from Ukraine. Okay, that's what I've been told. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. Now that data goes into their big machine and says, oh, this person, claimed confidently that they have Ukrainian ancestry, and now now that DNA sequence gets lumped in and compared to other people and will be used to tell other people the probability that you're from that part of the world is X%. So it's a big, big challenge. I will tell you, my knowledge of the ancestry algorithms is much more limited than my knowledge of the medical testing. This is a whole specialty area unto itself. Genetic genealogy is, there's people who this is their life's work. They're really experts on using different techniques other than the straight sequencing. So for example, if you can look at haplotypes, which are big pieces of chromosome that have been passed on and inherited, you can look at Y DNA, which is only inherited from male to male. You can look at mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from mothers. So there's all these kind of other fancier techniques that allow people to go back in time with a little bit more accuracy. But at the end of the day, the biggest limitation, you're right, is it 17 people we're making statements about, or is it 17,000 people? And there's not a reliable public place to find that out in all cases. It was a very long-winded answer, but it was an excellent question.
Alan McCutcheon.
Yes, I have an anecdote that raises a couple of questions. I'm advising a person who has a quite striking Marfanoid habitus, but and for those of you who don't know what that means, that's long arms and legs and fingers and toes, tall, and sometimes hypermobile in joints and so on. And so this person was negative on the Marfan's test. And so the first issue was I wanted this person to be seen by a local adult geneticist. And I could not find one outside the cancer area. And I was quite shocked. I finally went to Rades, to a friend of mine, and got help. And so the first question is, why would a sophisticated city or county of 3 million people or whatever not have an adult geneticist unrelated to cancer? Yeah. The second issue was that we sent off a test for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome as another possible diagnosis. And the company, much to my delight, added on some tests for things that they have found are related in terms of the phenotype to Ehlers-Danlos, but are not in the same gene. And back came a mutation for Loeys-Dietz syndrome, an abnormality in the transforming growth factor beta gene.
Yeah.
And so that question was, are there problems, ethical or whatever, for these added on tests? And how confident might we be in that? In terms of the phenotype, this person did not quite measure up to the most common phenotypic characteristic, but it seemed like it explained a lot of other things.
Yeah, yeah. I'll answer the second question first. Just the way that the testing companies have been driving the tests that get ordered has been quite remarkable. So when I first started, doing this nearly 30 years ago, you had to choose each gene individually, like, okay, and because it was so costly and so labor intensive, if I saw someone who was like, okay, I think you have Lynch syndrome, which is a hereditary predisposition to colon and uterine and other cancers. Do I start with one gene, and then if that one's negative, then I reflex to the next gene, and if that one's negative, then I reflex? So reflex testing was a way to kind of control costs. I trained in Canada, so this was, kind of the norm, but it was how it was done in the US as well. Once next generation sequencing became available around 2015, and all the labs were like, it literally doesn't matter if we're testing one gene or we're testing 200 genes. It takes the same amount of time. The process of interpretation is the same. It's all aided by computer. And so as a selling point, what a lot of the companies did was really go out and promote to different specialties. You know, hey, cardiology, we now have an easy test, and it's so easy. You don't have to go through and write a medical justification for each gene that you're going to test for like you used to. As long as one of these genes is medically indicated, you buy one, you get 50 for free. And they're curated by the companies, because the companies, and these are the medical companies, right? These aren't the direct to consumer ones. They have a vested interest in gathering this data and improving their products as well, right? So if they're collecting all the sequencing data on the back end, and if the physicians are filling in the test request forms accurately and saying, well, here's my patient has hypermobility, my patient has large arm span, my patient has these features. Now that's written by a physician. That's not like just somebody on the internet saying stuff, right? So you assume there's a higher level of accuracy. Now the companies often end up being the ones publishing, saying, we have found an association between gene ABC123 and this disease. But these people may have a milder phenotype or less obvious features than people with this other condition that's closely related. So now a lot of the publications are not coming from genomic studies like they used to. They're actually coming from the testing labs that are doing this high volume, multi-gene testing rather than 1 or 2 genes at a time. So that's been a big change. It kind of piggybacks onto your question about why is there no adult geneticist in San Diego? There are 2. One is at the Naval Hospital, so you can only access her if you are at the Naval Hospital. The other was at Kaiser, but he recently retired. So unless you're a Kaiser patient, no adult geneticist. But yeah, UCSD, Sharp, Scripps. Part of it is because historically, training to become a board-certified medical geneticist meant you had to do a pediatrics residency first. That was your entree to becoming a geneticist, and that was the only path. Then years later, when it kind of like the numbers of people applying to become geneticists started dropping, because going through a peds residency and then going through a genetics residency was, a lot of work. If you're going to be a card-carrying pediatric geneticist, that's still the right way to do it. But, now it's opened up to internal medicine residents as well. So now there's a med pathway and a peds pathway and a combined med peds pathway. But it's going to take time to get that workforce, up to speed. One of my personal, if I do nothing before I retire, it's that I want to see UCSD hire an adult geneticist, because do you know who triages all of those queries that come in for Marfan and everything else? It's me. I'm not a physician. I'm trained as a genetic counselor and I can order tests, but I've only ever practiced in cancer. I certainly cannot lay hands on a patient and make a clinical diagnosis. But I can certainly talk about risk and order appropriate tests in the cancer setting. But it's a massive gap. Sometimes our colleagues over at Rady Genetics will help a patient out if it's somebody and they're really kind of stuck. But otherwise, we have to refer to UCLA. There's a telehealth genomics company now that's decent. Same thing, though, they can't do a physical exam, so you're kind of out of luck there. But the answer to the question is there just aren't that many adult geneticists to begin with. And then to try and find one and recruit them to UCSD, then, all of you, I'm sure, are more than familiar about the challenges in trying to get a new position funded and approved at UCSD. It's a bit of a slog, particularly when we would have to make it a very attractive position because it's so competitive to find a board certified adult geneticist. I wish I had a more optimistic answer for you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh, I have a question from Leslie Bruce. Is Leslie still online? Do you want to ask it out loud or should I read it? I don't see.
I'm here. I can answer. I can ask.
Go ahead. Go for it. Ask your question.
Everybody in the family has done the ancestry and all of that, and it's sort of fun. And I'm having been at the School of Medicine for, was for a while, that it makes me nervous that they're going to sell my DNA to a pharmaceutical company or the Chinese or something. And so am I right to be worried? I mean, what is the likelihood that they will sell the DNA samples that they're receiving?
So they won't necessarily sell the sample, but the data, so the DNA sequence that's generated. And for the ancestry type of companies, it's almost 100% that it has already been sold. That's part of their business model.
Yeah.
Reason and it's, like everything in life, if something seems like too cheap to be good quality, then chances are there's a reason for it. They're not making their money on the $50 or $99 genetic testing that they're offering you, right? They're just probably breaking even on that. Really, it's the partnerships with pharma, where pharma wants to know not only the DNA sequence, but how did people, because when you sign up for one of these services, you get reams and reams of questionnaires. Now we're going to ask you some questions about your medical history. Now we're going to ask you some questions about your family history. And people will happily fill it in. Like I said, you're obviously under no legal obligation to do so. And mine are all blank. You'd think I'd have the healthiest history and the healthiest family in the history of mankind, because it's just, there's nothing there. But for people, and sometimes they'll do targeted programs, and I don't want to sound all negative about it, because some good things have come out of it. So for example, 23andMe did partner with the Parkinson's advocacy organizations. And they basically said, look, there are families out there where Parkinson's is running in the family. It clearly looks to be genetic. We don't have a lot of great information. We don't have a lot of great samples. So we'll offer free testing to anybody who comes in through these organizations. So you're not just going online and saying, I have Parkinson's, I want free testing, right? It's people who have been associated with these organizations and could confirm a diagnosis, and then their family members could get free testing as well. And they partnered with a pharma company. And my understanding is they actually found something that's potentially leading to a treatment. People are kind of excited about it. So good things can happen. I think the idea is the transparency, right? If it's clearly stated up front, and you're like, I mean, how many of us update our phones and just click the yes, and we don't know what's in there? But we've kind of trained ourselves to be used to these pages and pages of terms of service, and we just agree to them. Same thing here. And this is one where you really do want to kind of have an understanding, especially, to me, the biggest concern is, as long as, the goal is to do good things that improve medical care, I'm generally okay with that. Somebody's going to make a buck on it. That's fine. Like that's how the world is. It's more like, how could this get out there and be used in a way that has potential risks of harm? And I don't quite know what those risks are. They say things like, well, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear. But, what if I suddenly end up as a DNA match for something because I've made outspoken political comments in a place or location where those are not being well received, like those are, and that sounds paranoid and crazy conspiracy theory. This is the stuff movies get made off of, right?
Yeah.
But these are odd times, and you never know. You just never know. So I as long as things are transparent and your personal level of comfort is fine with it, then but in terms of it being sold, it has already. That cat's out of the bag. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question from Mr. Wolb. I don't know if I pronounced it properly. Is that person still here? R. Wolb? Well, the question was, what are the more reliable health ancestry genetic companies? I assume some are better than others. Are some better than others?
Yeah, so I always try, and I want to declare, I should have put a slide in, I don't have a conflict of interest with any of these companies. I have never taken a cent or even a cup of coffee from any of these genetic test companies. I could have retired and been in the association by now if I had taken up all the offers, but I've chosen not to. But in terms of health testing, There are two companies that do medical grade testing, but it's open to anybody. You can pay out of pocket for it. And it's one of these, it's called like a physician mediated test. So it's not your own physician that orders it. You go online and you kind of say, oh, I want to do the cancer, cardiac, and medication test. So that's $350. I'm going to click on that. And then it will say, you know, one of our physicians will review your request and then place your order, and then we'll send you a saliva kit. It's direct to consumer in that you're never meeting this physician. They're not going over your medical record and determining, like, is this really the right test for you? These are intended to be screening tests for healthy, curious people. These are not intended to be a medically indicated, you have a diagnosis and we want to get it sorted out type of test. So the two companies that offer those, there's Color, C-O-L-O-R, Color Genomics, and the other one is Invitae, I-N-V-I-T-A-E, that currently offer those products now. I'm not endorsing them, but they are, you know, if I get a report back from either of those labs, I will use it to make medical recommendations for people. They are medically validated labs. A human being signs off. I can order from either of those labs as a healthcare provider myself, and I do, use them both. So those are the two. In terms of like Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, those types of things, they're just not using the technology that can give you reliable medical information. It's more likely to be a false positive. And because they're only testing like 12 letters out of a whole book, essentially, to go back to the analogy, you're missing most of where these mutations are actually located. You're just not getting tested for them at all. So for health purposes, I cannot recommend those tests at all.
That's very interesting. But you do have that, they have some descriptive accuracy about the geographical distribution of your ancestry. That part is more plausible. As
For Ancestry, it's fine,
Yeah.
because the letters that they're testing have
Yeah.
been specifically selected because they track with Ancestry. So that's why those are the ones that are getting tested. Do they overlap with medical risks? Not really, which is why you're not really getting good medical.
that's a
information.
very important message that you're making. I
Yeah.
wonder, the people are moving around all over the world. I even wonder about the other one, is that, isn't there an extraordinary diversity? How do we know, what do we mean, but that somebody comes from, I don't know, the Caucasus, with this part of Asia or Africa, there's so much movement in those parts of the world that how specific is that? But that must be based on some kind of information, I think. Josh, are you still here? You had a question.
Yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
So I had two, but I'll skip one of them. So I'm interested in the genetic risks behind getting very bad valley fever. And Filipinos turn out to be in that category. And what I found is that there are so few Pacific Islanders in the database that you referred to, that they are lumped in with Asia.
Yeah.
They are genetically distinct.
Yeah.
So that when we began analysis of the DNA, what came up was Asia.
Yeah.
But in fact, when you talk to the people who gave you the DNA, they turn out to be not only Filipino, but other Pacific Islanders.
Other Pacific Islander, and a lot of Spanish DNA as well.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so of course there's a lot of Spanish DNA in the Philippines, and there was a paper in Science about the genetic variability in the Philippines. I wrote to the authors and they would not even reply to me. The data was never put into a public database.
Yeah. So that's exactly, that point, the one that Dr. Dimsdale made, the idea that, and it's this weird tension between, like, if only we had a database of all the people from everywhere, then we would know like what is just normal human variation from person to person and what is potentially disease causing in the context of different genetic backgrounds. On the other hand, a lot of groups around the world have rightfully been very hesitant to participate in large-scale genomic studies because of stories like the one that came out of Iceland. This was attempted in Newfoundland, on the east coast of Canada, maybe 20, 25 years ago as well. So this is the challenge, right? It's this, a lot of it gets into what Dr. Sadler's life's work has been, which is community-based research and letting the community kind of drive how the research goes rather than the researchers coming in and saying, give me your DNA, we're going to do a project and hopefully one day you'll benefit from this, but probably not. Diversity in these genetic databases is incredibly important, and there's a lot of moves being made, you know, like the All of Us study, like the UK Biobank, like a lot of similar types of studies to try to improve at least upon what we have. But as you go looking for more genetically isolated populations, it becomes more difficult to get those samples and to get the communities on board if you're coming in from outside the community. So a lot of convergence with the attendees today. I love it.
Yeah, because, you know, in our situation, whatever the polymorphism is in their genome that affects their susceptibility to this fungus, it never happens to them until they move to California.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
What doesn't happen, John?
Well, you can't get valley fever in the Philippines. It's
Oh, I see.
restricted to the southeast United States, pretty much.
Got it. Okay,
It's a fungal infection.
got it. Okay. Okay. Are there more questions that we have? I've read through pretty much the whole the chats, and I don't see any hands up. So, great. Lisa, do you have any parting thoughts that to?
No, thank you for your comments and your questions. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak to this group. If anybody does have any questions, I know sometimes people have personal questions they want to ask and don't want to do it in a public forum. You can look up my email address and please feel comfortable emailing me directly if there's any personal stuff that people want to ask about. I'm happy to at least triage it. Oh, Georgia has a question.
There was one amazing murder solved here based on Ancestry.com. When we first moved to California, Barbara, and I can't remember her last name right now, but she lived very close to the university, was brutally murdered. And the murder went unsolved for years and years and decades. And just recently, maybe in the last 2 years, they were able to make a connection with some blood results from the scene through Ancestry.com, I think it was, and found a family member, and they were able to make the match to the killer. He had already passed away.
Yeah.
But so right close to home, we had that in our own backyard, literally across the street from campus.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Excuse
I
me,
use
John.
I use one of those things. It's interesting the different motives. I use one of those things, Ancestry or something, not for medical, but I was very curious about the diversity of family backgrounds. And I was very surprised to find out how, you know, undiverse my family background was. I thought that we probably came from all over the place, but we didn't. I was surprised. Lisa, well, I
Excuse me.
want to thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. We had a lot of people I saw online, so clearly there's a lot of interest in the work that you're doing, and thank you very much for sharing it with us.
No problem. Was there a voice piping up there just a second ago?
Is there a
Yes, I
voice
was
in
just
you?
going to say that Josh Fier didn't read his first question. And all of us studies, do they use exon or whole genome sequencing?
I'm not sure. I believe the first pass is exome, but my understanding is the idea is to hold on to the DNA and be able to use it for genome down the road. But I don't know that for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, you read it out. I didn't see that one. Thanks very much, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Thank you for
My pleasure.
sharing your afternoon with us. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. And good evening, everybody. Have a good
Evening.
afternoon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.